Okay, good evening. Welcome to Edible Education, the Berkeley Changemaker. All right, maybe I could have your attention. Thank you. We'll get started now. I thought I would start this evening and give you a preview of what's going on in the garden. Before I came here this afternoon, I was wrestling this blanket over a Meyer lemon tree. Why am I doing that? Frost. Yeah, it's going to get really cold tonight. It could be 25 degrees. Citrus trees in California and elsewhere do not like below freezing temperatures. And it's really interesting what happens, but the plant itself just starts to congeal and shrivel up, and sometimes they can just completely die. What's interesting to me about this particular Meyer lemon tree is that over the last, I would say that tree is probably 40 or 50 years old, even though I've only been taking care of it for about 22 years. It's grown up underneath the shade of another much taller tree, which you can kind of see in the background, but it's created a natural oven, if you will, or kind of container that protects that tree. And it's just another example of how these trees become, and the plants become interdependent in the ecosystem and really support one another. I also wanted to show you the emergence of the new rose leaves, which is always an exciting thing at this time of the year. Roses are deciduous, which means they lose their leaves. And so from about January till last week, they're all bare, and I go in there and I prune them very carefully, and they just look like twigs. As a matter of fact, fun fact, my last name, Rosenzweig, means rose branch. So I got my first rose bush at age, I think, 5 or 6 as a gift from a gardener. That's a whole nother story. I also wanted to let you know that Larissa Zimberoff, who was here last week, her article was published in The Atlantic today. Silicon Valley is coming for your chocolate. So remember, she made a reference to that. So if you want to look that up in The Atlantic, it's really interesting. It's a good continuation of last week's lecture. So tonight, how might we identify connections and leverage points in our inflamed food system and beyond? And we have a very, very special guest. I would say one of the founding fathers of the edible education class from its earliest days, Raj Patel, who spent about 15 years here in Berkeley earlier in his career, is now at the University of Texas, Austin. He flew in especially to see us tonight, and he's going to talk about his latest book and also share one of his other documentary film projects with us. And Raj, if you look him up on Wikipedia, which is always a good thing to do, it notes that Raj is a rock star of activist writing. So he is a change maker in his own right. His book, Stuffed and Starved, is really one of the seminal influences, I think, on the food movement, looking really at the global food system of undernourishment and overeating. And I guess that was really a prelude to this book in some ways. So with inflammation kind of emanating from those inequities and back and forth. So we're going to give the floor to Raj, and let's have a really special welcome for Raj Patel.
Thank you so much. Look at that magic. Oh, thank you, Pooja. Hello. I'm very happy to see you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very pleased that Pooja is taking care of everything, because otherwise it would all go horribly wrong. Thank you. Well, you know, the night is young. Anyway, so this is what I want to talk to you about. But I was told that we need a little bit of sort of ice breaking. You can tell that I don't particularly care for learning objectives and things like that. But I was told, see, look, it is in fact already going horribly wrong. I'm going to press some buttons, and we're going to see if this does anything. Okay, look at you. Thank you. Right. Partner activity. Yes. So find a partner, and we're going to spend 2 minutes for you to play disease bingo. What we're going to do is find out how many of these diseases you have in your family. And this is just a sort of gentle conversation where you get to discuss with your partner whether there is in your family a history, or you've come across type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, colorectal cancer, chronic kidney disease, heart disease, asthma, multiple sclerosis, depression, Alzheimer's, and long COVID. So just get to know a little bit about the diseases around you. Now's as good a time as any. And we're going to just spend 2 minutes for you to connect with someone and learn a little bit about their family medical history in a way that doesn't violate anyone's privacy. Okay. That's quite enough irritable bowel syndrome. But, you know, this is. Did anyone get bingo? Do we have a line? Any of these? Someone tell me. So, what did that conversation reveal to you? Is there anyone here who had 0 of these diseases in their family? Right. That, I think, is the big educational point that needed to be made. But you might also be surprised that these are diseases that are connected because they are associated with inflammation. And these are diseases that have that have become increasingly prevalent. And there's an interesting story behind that. So let's get into this by first asking what inflammation is. And at some point, this is all going to work. There we are. Oh, there we are. Look, I'm just going to stare meaningfully at this. So inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. And you'll know inflammation, for example, when you're reading your favorite volume of Karl Marx's Capital. You'll flick through the pages, you'll get a paper cut, and then you'll get acute inflammation. And so when you have a paper cut, you'll notice, this is the way they teach in medical school with Latin, calor, dolor, rubor, and tumor. There will be heat as your wound gets, the blood rushes to the wound and warms the wound. There will be pain, there will be redness, there will be swelling. And that process of inflammation is good. It is how it is that your body heals itself. And at some point, inflammation comes to an end, and you're left with just a teeny scar and a happy reminder of that particular page of Das Kapital. But the problem with inflammation is that under certain circumstances, it doesn't stop. And chronic inflammation is a problem. And it's associated with the rise of a range of diseases. And I mean, these are just sort of a few of the ones that were most immediately understood as chronic, diseases associated with inflammation. So Crohn's, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, and asthma. But increasingly, we're seeing all those other diseases that you had fun playing bingo with also understood as diseases that have an inflammatory or a component of inflammation. Now, this is a food system discussion because we know already that there are diets that can help reduce inflammation. Is anyone here, by the way, on an anti-inflammatory diet? Does anyone know what that is? So, I mean, there are foods that you can eat, and there are diets that are being peddled that say, look, eat whatever it is, more oranges, eat more leafy greens, eat all the things that, as a Berkeley resident, you're mandated to eat. Lots of kale, eat local and organic food, and your inflammatory profile will improve. And to some extent, that's true because we have data suggesting that the standard American diet, which you will know by now abbreviates to SAD, it is associated with inflammation. We know that diseases that are rich in fiber, for example, are diets that are better for better at reducing the sort of pro-inflammatory markers. in your digestive system. And so one way that people are trying to treat this massive outbreak of inflammation and inflammatory disease is by, rejecting fast food and going towards things that are higher in fiber. And there's a sort of a small business opportunity here for the right kind of providers of diet to be able to get your markers of inflammation lower. The problem is, though, that the food system isn't just what you put in your body. For instance, it's true that the air that we breathe can cause inflammation. This is from the journal Toxicology in 2014 that observed that glyphosate, Roundup, is associated with inflammatory airways, or the inflammation of the airways. And of course, the global food system's toxins are everywhere. And chances are they're in you right now. This was a paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago where it was observed that one of the components of Agent Orange, 2,4-D, is now in the blood of 1 in 3 Americans. Now, there's an interesting footnote here. 2,4-D is one of the things that gardeners were encouraged to use over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's what do you think is the profile when it comes to race of exposure to this particular pesticide? Yes. Minorities are exposed more often. This is the one case where it is not the case that minorities are exposed more often, because you need a lawn to be able to spray 2,4-D on. And so the exposure, at least in this study, is one that correlates not with low-income communities of color being predominantly exposed, but in fact, white folk who are using, who have access to lawns have higher levels of 2,4-D in their blood. This is just a very strange twist on the usual story of environmental exposure. But suffice to say, 1 in 3 Americans now has this in their blood, and the long-term consequences of this are unlikely to be good. So I wanted to observe this and then say, well, what could we do? We've had a lovely, I don't suppose you probably noticed the waves of testosterone as tech bros outside were trying to figure out how to save the planet and make their first million. But there are interesting ways in which there are attempts to monetize a response to inflammation. One of the things we know about inflammation is that it is related to the creatures that live in and around us. And insofar as in the global north we've been very good at killing these creatures, our levels of inflammation have often been observed to go higher. But there are places in the world where the microbes that live in our microbiome, in our guts, look very different to the ones that exist in your stomach. So for example, if you live in the global north, the diversity of bacteria and other beings in your gut is lower than in other bits of the world. There is, it varies across the planet. In northern Brazil and southern Venezuela, the microbiome of indigenous communities, the Yanomami indigenous community, looks very different to our microbiome. And there are, you'll be able to get all this on the video of the slides, and all you have to observe here is that across a range of phenomena, there's a stark difference between, if you look up at the top left, the sort of purple cluster is microbiomes from people in the United States, and down in the bottom left is, in red, Yanomami communities in Brazil. These are various markers associated with the biodiversity of the gut, but also its inflammatory markers. Now, one response has been to take the microbiome of Yanomami communities and transplant it into people in the global north who have diseases that might be treated with an infusion of a new sort of range of biodiverse bacteria. And it has, in the cases where it's been attempted, often resulted in some very beneficial outcomes. And you can read more about this in a New York Times article. This would be the title of it. And this article asks, look, we've got lots of evidence to suggest that you can fight inflammation by taking the microbiome, and by I mean taking the microbiome, what I mean is stealing the shit of indigenous communities, turning it into a capsule and eating it. And this can rewild your microbiome, and it can bring back the biodiversity that being exposed to glyphosate and 2,4-D and the range of toxins that are in our bodies right now that has denuded. And so you might think, well, you know what? There's money to be made here. Because if we get the right kinds of indigenous poop and we can turn it into the right kind of pill, there is no end to the kinds of diseases that might be treated this way. And if you think that, then there's a bunch of people outside who would love to hear from you. But since you are confined to this room and not to the tech bros outside, I want to observe that that kind of thinking, unfortunately, is very old. It's the kind of thinking that Christopher Columbus had when he came here. From his diary, this quote always just infuriates me. I can never tire my eyes in looking at such lovely vegetation, so different from ours. I believe there are many herbs and many trees that are worth much in Europe for dyes and for medicine, but I do not know them, and this causes me great sorrow. This is, the first tech bro. When he came, and he clearly knew he was looking at money, and the sad part was that he didn't know how much it was. But that's the world that we find ourselves in, where it is possible to imagine a revamped food system that what we could do is just spend a lot of money innovating around the microbiome, stealing the poop of the people who haven't destroyed the planet, and then turning that into the right kind of pill that will reduce our inflammatory profile. Let's not do that. Let's instead think about other ways and systemic ways that we might counter inflammation. And to do that, we need to ask, what's inflammation again? Well, inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. Now, this is important because your body learns how to anticipate danger. A fight or flight response is precisely a learned response to understanding that that snap of the twig over there could just be someone coming home, or it could be something very large that wants to eat you. The stories that we tell one another, the narratives that we have, are ways in which our body senses danger. Look, here's a story. A man from the government comes to your door, knocks on the door, and gives you a letter. Now, that's what happens, but the content of that story will provoke different levels of fear depending on your circumstances and depending on what it is that you are anticipating. If you are anticipating that the person from the government is your mail carrier and they are giving you a Christmas card, a birthday card, and you get the birthday card and you are happy, that's one visit from the government that ends well. But if you are living paycheck to paycheck, and what you're worried about is being evicted, and the knock on the door is the bailiff or the sheriff coming to turf you out, then that's a different kind of worry. And if you live with that chronic anxiety around being evicted, or you live with a chronic anxiety because you're worried about being able to put food on the table and afford insulin, and being able to make sure that your kids have something nice for their birthday, and being able to make rent and do a range of other things, then that chronic stress can result in inflammation, just by dint of the stories that are told. And so, we know that poverty is associated with inflammation. Poverty drives chronic inflammation. C-reactive protein is one of the markers that's used to track inflammation. And we know that socioeconomic inequalities, particularly around class, drive that. But you will be unsurprised to see that race is also a factor in the driving of inflammation. If you are, to be black in America and to be worried about the police is a reasonable thing to be doing. And levels of C-reactive protein in certain communities are so high that, in fact, sleep doesn't provide an end to the worry and the anxiety. Normally, in healthy bodies, in healthy societies, your levels of C-reactive protein will go down when you sleep. But if you are worried all the time about rent, or you're worried about living in a racist society, those levels of C-reactive protein can stay high. Now, there is a way of tackling this. One way of thinking systemically about inflammation is not to steal indigenous poop, but in fact to remove some of the policies that drive anxiety, worry, depression, and one of those policies is payday loans. If you don't know what a payday loan is, I'm grateful. But it's one of these sort of moments of usury, particularly targeted at working Americans, where you'll borrow $300 and can end up paying $800 back, and you'll borrow $300, just to be able to have cash in hand, to be able to make rent, to be able to put food on the table a few days before your paycheck comes due. Now, if we were to and in the states where payday loans have been regulated, you've seen reductions in suicide rates and in drug abuse and alcohol abuse. And in one study, it was suggested that the levels of suicide would drop by 3%, and the levels of fatal drug overdoses would drop by 8.9% if we ended payday loans in America. So let's just rehearse where we've come. We started off talking about inflammation, and we recognize that our bodies are teeming with reasons for inflammation. And what I've suggested is you can treat that with poop, but you don't want to do that. What we need is more systemic solutions. And one of the ways to think about that is to think about policies that particularly alleviate the burden of working communities in the United States, and banning payday loans is a systemic way of reducing levels of inflammation, particularly for working class Americans. And that's a way of just, systems talk, right? This is about systemic problems need systemic solutions. So now you may be saying, well, all right, look, what's this got to do with the food system? Well, in part, of course, who is it that is most exploited in the United States today? 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in America, as you will hear much more from Saru Jayaraman next week, are in the food system. And so if we are interested in reducing levels of inflammation and inflammatory disease in the United States, then actually food system workers are on the front lines of exploitation. And working to be able to end that exploitation is a really good strategy for reducing levels of disease in the United States. But this is collective work. And the good news is, in American history, it's been done before. The American food system is incredibly concentrated. I'm sorry, Pooja, this wonderful machine is now starting to reconnect, possibly to the Zoom people, so we may have lost them. They're charming people, though. Excellent. Okay. So in the United States, this is a cartoon that I quite like, and this is from an 1889 magazine, but this is in the Gilded Age. And what you have is mortgage interest on your mortgage farm. You see the farmers here on the left bowing to the trusts here on the right. So the trusts are the monopolies, and it's a callback to the feudal era up there in the top left, where you see peasants giving to the lords. But this idea that the rich steal from the poor is alive and well in America. And when it comes to the food system, concentrated power is nothing new. But it is true that through the last few financial crises, as you will know, financial crises are moments of consolidation in every industry. And in the food industry, that's no exception. In the food industry in the United States, the top 4 companies' share of the market across a range of different food classes is high and rising. So I just want to sort of point out that the United States is kind of based on ideas of concentration of power in the food system and of the exploitation of workers. This is something that can and should be challenged. And again, America has some fantastic history of resisting corporate power and resisting the kinds of power in the food system that have generated inflammatory disease. And rather than resisting inflammatory disease individually, people have been doing it collectively. Now, since I now come from Texas, it's important for me to share that lots of good ideas come from the South, from the US South. And in part, that's because the US South is where the worst forms of agricultural capitalism flourished. So take Texas, for example, the state that fought for slavery twice. I think it's important to say that because, A, people don't realize that Texas was formed by a bunch of white people, including Stephen F. Austin, the man for whom the city in which I live is named. But so he comes to set up agricultural capitalism. He needs enslaved people to work his cotton plantation, and he stewards the creation of a state that first fights Mexico in order to make slavery legal, and then fights, of course, the North as part of the Civil War. So all of this is to say that Texas and the South, because it has long been a crucible of hatreds and also of deep exploitation in the food system and in U.S. agriculture, has some long experience of making things shitty. But it is also the case that workers in Texas, for example, have done some very good work. And I just want to share a couple of examples from the South of workers who've done some tremendous stuff. One is a rather famous strike. Sorry, Pooja. There it is. Magic. Can I make this? Well, yes, the Great Cowboy Strike of 1883. Throw that on the floor. Most of you think of cowboys as individuals who sort of sit in their horse and look stonily at the landscape. But in fact, these are food system workers. And in 1883, this particular strike was timed to happen just before the cattle were taken to market. And it allowed a range of workers to win great victories, not just for them, but for everyone who was involved in agricultural labor. So first of all, they wanted sort of high wages for everyone, and they say, they demand that we will not work for less than $50 per month. They also asked for a range of things to be able to make their time on the trail more survivable. They asked for a knife to play mumble peg with, and I will tell you all about mumble peg the next time I come. But they also asked for, let's see, could you? Thank you. Good cooks shall also receive $50 per month. And I think this is just an important moment to appreciate what good solidarity and what good organizing looks like. Because what these food service workers were very interested in, or food system workers were very interested in, is recognizing that in order for them to do their work, they need to be cared for. And those care workers need to be paid the same as them. Now, this may seem like a sort of a strange and alien moment in thinking about the food system. But it is important to remember that in some of the earliest strikes, before unions were ever legal in the United States, these workers were banding together to make the food system more survivable for the workers, and not just for them, but for everyone. Wall-to-wall organizing, it's called. And this is tremendously important because this is also part of the history of how, for example, the New Deal was won. And if you want to know about that, Professor Cohen back there will be leading the charge and teaching more about that. Sorry, Professor Cohen, can you just wave your hand? There we are. Talk to that man afterwards. He's a genius. But in the meantime, let me just sort of skip through some of the sort of the history of strikes, because we can get to that. But I want us to think more about inflammation. And yeah, look, it is working. Splendid. It's important to understand, finally, when we think about inflammation, what we're also thinking about is how we fit in society. Now, I've talked about workers. I've talked about how it is that collective approaches to solving problems that manifest themselves individually have a history in the United States. But I also want to just remind us that we are on colonized land here, that we are, most of us, settlers in land that is not ours. And this matters because inflammation is the body's immune response to danger or the threat of danger. And I think the word that we've become all too familiar with is the word immune. But it's not entirely clear. I mean, where does the word immune come from? Does anyone know? Anyone at all? No Latin? Okay, well, that's fair enough. I get it. So when the Romans were busy colonizing the Mediterranean, they needed a way of talking about the places that they were colonizing that allowed that there were cities that were not Rome, that were studded around the Mediterranean, but these cities were not quite as good as Rome. So they could be free under the Roman Empire, but they needed to be differentiated. And so the term that was coined for the idea of a free city was a civita libera et immunis. And to be Roman, in Rome, you had certain duties, munera. And because this word munera exists today in the idea of the municipality. But if you were immune, you were freed from the duties of being a Roman citizen, but also you were not quite as good as a Roman citizen. So the idea of immunity is sort of like us, but not really like us. And that's the logic that's at play when you think about your immune system. That's why, for example, these metaphors of you're fighting something off. You're sniffling a bit and you're a little under the weather. You're fighting something off. You're invoking the idea of your body as sovereign territory, and this invader has come in and you are fighting it off. Now, that is one way of thinking about the immune system, about what our body is doing. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is to say that we're learning to live with something. I mean, the vaccine is nothing but us learning to live with a certain kind of new viral form. So there are ways in which our social language of colonization and domination has managed to sneak into the way we think of our bodies and the ways that it lives with other beings. But just because we use the word immunity, we don't have to think of it as us versus them. We don't have to think of our bodies as fighting off the invading hordes. And there's a good medical sort of reason here to think about ways of fighting inflammation, and that don't involve the idea of war, but involve the idea of living with other beings. Remember, we were talking earlier on about how your microbiome is about a range of beings that are living inside you. The more diverse, often the better. When we are, these are beings that are not human, but without which we cannot exist well. And the way in which we live with one another and live with other kinds of beings in our bodies is very central to the idea of whether we are, in fact, inflamed or not. And another way of thinking about this is, again, a story from the South. If we are interested in living together in good systems, then solidarity can be anti-inflammatory. Now, what I mean by that is the idea that some of the best organizing in the food system that has worked to push back against the excesses of exploitation and of the diseases that follow from it. Some of that best organizing is very intentionally about organizing with people who do not look like you. The history of the South and the history of certain kinds of Southern populism, which I use in a positive sense, are ways of organizing against the rich by poor communities who had been driven apart by histories of racism. So this, for example, is from the Southern Tenants and Farmers, Southern Tenant Farmers Union, Southern Tenant Farmers Union in 1937. And you can see that there's a diversity of people who are listening to a speaker. And you'll also, I mean, this is another picture from a similar meeting. of workers reading together and studying together, and women in particular. And I think this is important just because there's always a gendered component, and again, Sarah's going to talk about this much more next week, to the way that exploitation works in the food system. And maybe one of the most important folk who organized around this was also a Texas woman. I want to sort of end with the story of Emma Tenayuca. So she was indigenous Mexican American, and she was a communist organizer who initially was organizing workers who were involved in the pecan industry in San Antonio. She, was also a sort of street fighter against the Immigration and Naturalization Service, because the INS, which is now sort of Border Patrol, was a force of terror among the Mexican and Mexican-American workers who were part of the Pecan Strike. So part of the pecan workers' workforce. And so people, while San Antonio was firmly in the United States, it depended on Mexican-American and Mexican workers coming across the border, and the INS terrorized them. At the workers, so at the boss's behest. Emma Tenayuca got involved in this struggle when the pecan workers went on strike. She organized them initially just for higher wages, but in her own words, this struggle moved from just higher wages to a strike about dignity, about food security, and about solidarity across the divides of race, of class, and of gender. And I like this story because it suggests that in the South, there's been a long history of people organizing together, and it is organizing that is going to be the long-term solution to our inflammatory diseases. It's not a pill. As we, there are lots of moments of Southern history that I would like to regale you with as I'm learning about them. One of them is like the idea of the Rainbow Coalition. This at the moment is Reverend Jesse Jackson, Willie Nelson, Jim Hightower, and Ralph Page at a Farm Aid meeting. But there are, even now, vestiges of this history playing out in the United States, where intentional organizing across race and organizing being led by women of color. By the Emma Tenayucas and their history as not as communist organizers, but as organizers around who learn their politics through socialism. These stories are alive and well in the food system, and they promise not just to give us a much better food system, but also to be able to then reduce our levels of inflammation and the diseases that you spent the first few minutes of this talk enumerating to yourselves. So maybe I should stop there, because what I want to do is entertain your questions, talk with Will, and see if we can get to the bottom of what it is that we need systemically to do to think about moving away from a world that is making our bodies inflamed. So let's stop there.
Please think of your questions. Let's make this as much of a conversation as we can tonight. There's a microphone here, and there's a microphone there. So if you'd like to share a question, please do. And maybe, Pooja, you could just change that slide. That would be great. So that was really fascinating, connecting all those disparate ideas. And what I really heard you say was, don't reach for the technological silver bullet as the fix, especially if it co-ops someone else's property, which is kind of part of the playbook, as you pointed out. And then you're also equating sort of the biodiversity that we need inside with the biodiversity and the diversity that we need outside, and that solidarity, that was really a powerful idea, that solidarity in organizing can be anti-inflammatory. So going across identities, disciplines, comfort zones. It's interesting. We're all trying to get a comfort zone in here. Yeah, you need one of those. Yeah. That'll help. It's always so strange talking with these masks. What led you to write this book with your co-author? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this was a book that
just came out, right?
Last
fall.
Yes, in the fall. But it started actually at Berkeley many years ago. I was dressed as a genetically modified tomato at a protest against Monsanto here on campus. And Rupa, who was a physician at UCSF, but was also part of the band Rupa and the April Fishes, was providing musical accompaniment as we did a play about the evils of the Monsanto Corporation. And so Rupa and I became friends then. And we realized through our friendship that she was seeing a world, particularly as being a touring musician, in which she was seeing higher levels of inflammation in the hospital, but also seeing that the movements and groups that she was able to tour with and visit were coming up with some really interesting ideas around how to treat these inflammatory diseases that were not about conventional medicine, but were nonetheless about healing away from the hospital. And for me, I was doing a lot of work around food systems and looking at peasant movements, and noticing that peasant movements spend a lot of time thinking about medicine and thinking about food as healing. And so in the end, our conversations came closer and closer, and during the pandemic, we had the chance to sort of write it all up together.
Wonderful. Is anyone here studying any aspect of the microbiome here on campus? Because there's a couple of labs here that are doing some interesting work. Professor Bowles, Tim Bowles' lab is looking at the soil microbiome.
Yes.
And I know Professor Eisen, Michael Eisen, who's a computational biologist and geneticist, has been doing work on the microbiome. It's interesting, also one of our friends here from Edible Ed, Christopher Gardner, who's at Stanford, he's done a tremendous amount of work recently confirming what you started off saying, that fiber was so important to feed your gut health, and that there's been so much emphasis in the US diet, the SAD diet, on protein, all these bars with protein, but we're deficient for the most part in getting enough of the right kinds of fiber.
Well, yeah, and that's sort of just emblematic of the American sort of individual approach to everything, really. I mean, in other parts of the world, the reason that people buy organic food is not because my body's a temple and I don't want to I want it to be violated by anything that the chemical industry has produced. No, you buy organic because it looks after the world around you. It means that farm workers are much less exposed to pesticide. It means that farm worker families are going to be, the children of farm workers are going to be less afflicted by the generational consequences of being exposed to pesticides. Whereas in the United States, it's very interesting, that there's a really strong, there's a curious overlap between the organic consumers and the anti-vax sort of individuals, because the idea is that, again, if you're eating organic food just because of its sort of healthful properties for your own body, then again, your body's a temple and the vaccine is just another thing that's going to pollute the purity of your body. Whereas everywhere else in the world, people who like organic food also get the vaccine because they understand, yes, look, no one loves the chemical industry, but no one loves Pfizer, but we also understand that we've got to look after grandma and we've got to look after the people who are more vulnerable in our communities, and that's why we do it. We take on a little bit of risk so that everyone's okay. And everywhere else in the world, people are just gobsmacked at how selfish we are. But that's the corollary of certain kinds of anti-inflammatory diet, of the high X diet or the high Y diet, because it's always about us. It's always an individual kind of knee-jerk reaction. And so, I'm all about the high-fiber diet. And you could say, well, the reason the high-fiber diet is good is because you're caring for the teeming microbes in your gut. You as a human don't necessarily need fiber, but we're recognizing now that all these other, these wonderful bacteria and wonderful microbes, not just bacteria, but archaea and a range of other things, these wonderful microbes need fiber. And so you're really feeding them and you're tending your garden. But if the overarching mode is still, it's all about me and I'm tending my garden, then you're being stupid because you're not realizing that the reason that Yanomami communities have a teeming microbiome is because they are surrounded by things that they haven't exterminated. You can't have a world in which we have rich internal microbiomes by doing the right diet, but nonetheless annihilate the world around us with pesticides. That, it just doesn't work that way. So the reason that Yanomami communities have a rich microbiome is because they have a rich macrobiome and they look after it. And they are not in the process of polluting it. Unfortunately, they are being killed by gold miners who are moving into Yanomami territory because it is, there's gold to be had, and the state is sponsoring the acquisition of that gold. All of which is to say, look, yes, it's important to have fiber in your diet, but think about the social structures that are driving you to think about it as a diet, right? As a discipline for yourself, as opposed to this is the way that we need to care for one another and the beings all around us. And a high fiber diet is just part of what it is that we get by accident when we care for the beings around us.
That's such a kind and logical approach, and it's just interesting to me that was not necessary, that inclusive kind of consciousness of our impact on others didn't naturally emerge universally during the pandemic.
Well, I mean, in some areas it was there already, and in some areas it just exacerbated what was already here in the United States. I mean, again, we have, and maybe this is a time to talk about a film that I was involved in, the trailer for which may or may not break this room. So I don't want to force anyone to make that happen. Sure. Here's a project. I'm going to tell you about this in a second, but this is a fun project. You might like this.
Ninasha wanangu alichi nguvasambizi abanyane nikupangire po movili muntu wakutuka ku uvili ngeko mwana kazi dangu lake ni isitiriwa uvili vaili malo ya mawilo ya vula nyingo inyake pachaka iko waka 3 ndikuti chili chose chayomira. SFHC akatiphalira kuti iyi ni climate change chifukwa cha ukhaliro wa banyitu wakuwalo nge wa America. Badango lithu balati kukhumba kuti vinthu visinthe tikumuyendera munthu kuchikaya kwake na kukadumbisana naye. Nkagomezga yayi nkhala ngenkhulota.
God said you can increase like sand, but he never said spoil the atmosphere.
I don't see it as an issue. That's my problem.
How are you seeing the climate affecting your family?
We see it more as a political agenda.
It would take a global catastrophe to do a complete 180.
Nkhani ya unenesko ikuchedwa kwenda. Kweni ya utesi kuchitavichi kwenda roiro. Kweni ise chigomezo utili nacho. Bali nyerere zinandi. Kweni junyere tuchoko tukunyamula panana.
So this project was one where I was working with a group called Soils, Food and Healthy Communities, who are based in Malawi. And through a series of accidents, our lead character said that she wanted to come to the United States to see what we were doing about climate change. And she met with organic farmers who, in general, some of them were incredibly supportive and understood these bonds of solidarity. And in other cases, they saw, as you heard there, what one of the women was saying, well, we just see climate change as a political issue. We're organic farmers, but we're doing it, really, again, to make sure that the soil is clean, and so that way our bodies don't get polluted. So it is possible in the United States to have this, before COVID, we had this individual kind of mentality before the shit hit the fan. And what COVID did was really just sort of expose that, I think.
Tell us more about the ants and the grasshopper.
So you may know the Aesop fable about the ants and the grasshopper, where the ants are doing all the hard work and the grasshopper's just sitting around and then decides at the end of the summer that he wants what the ants have. That's not this story. In Malawi, the idea of the ants and the grasshopper is that when a dead grasshopper needs to be hauled back to the ant colony, one ant can't do it, but lots of ants can. And so it is possible through collective action to move mountains. And one of the things that our hero says about the United States is that we have so many ants, but so few of us are ready to lift the grasshopper. So it is entirely possible for us to accomplish big things like tackle climate change, but we're choosing not to. And that's the problem that she confronts in this film, that we know that climate change is real, but we tell ourselves lies and feel like it's something we can postpone until tomorrow or do nothing about and be paralyzed by anxiety. But either way, we're not doing anything about it, which is why, again, Professor Daniel Cohen's Green New Deal class is one to take.
Anybody got a question, or I'll have to keep going here. Please, you're invited. I'll ask you one more about filmmaking, and you're an author, you're a filmmaker, you're producing, you've got another project in the works.
Yeah.
How do you organize yourself to do that? How do you decide what's the right medium to get the message out, as you express yourself as a change maker and an educator and activist, I guess?
Well, I mean, initially, the idea behind Stuffed and Starved is, before I wrote Stuffed and Starved, I was a policy analyst at a venerable Bay Area think tank called Food First. And although that organization has sort of crashed and burned, back then what I was doing was looking at trade policy. And I was looking at how the World Trade Organization was making things very difficult for farmers. And I was writing policy briefs, and we were sticking it online, and literally dozens of people were reading it. And it didn't seem like it was making much difference, which was a shame, because actually the World Trade Organization is something y'all need to know about, and you need to understand how it is that it is making life much harder for farmers. And so I wrote Stuffed and Starved as a way of explaining to a broader audience what was at stake, and why, again, we live in a world where there are 2 billion people who are food insecure and 2 billion people who are overweight, and why that can sometimes happen in the same body. So the idea of the food system needing to be explained was something I was like, yes, I'm going to write this book, and then it's going to be useful to just get it out there. And then I had the sort of naive idea that if you write a book, it's going to help change the world, without the other bit where you have to do all the organizing. And so that second part is what drove some more of the sort of recent work that I've been doing. And so this documentary, in part, I was doing it for the same reason I was doing the book, because I had something important to say and no one else was saying it. And the people who were saying things about food were pissing me off. I was often in other people's documentaries, and have you seen a movie called Food Inc.? But the moral of Food Inc. is that if we buy organic yogurt at Walmart, the world will change. And I don't think that is true. And I think worse than that, the ways that communities of color, in particular working class communities, are represented in film are always, the opening shot is of a working class community or someone suffering. It's always like this poor Latinx kid is suffering. They've got diabetes. Poor thing. They are their life is so hard. And then halfway through there'll be someone with a posh voice like me and say, well, yes, the poor have it tough. I don't know if you've noticed it, but there are some bad corporations out there. And then we'll move towards the end of the film. You'll see jangly guitar music and white people in farmers markets with metal straws and canvas bags. And we're told, if only we buy organic yogurt at Walmart, everything's going to be fine, jangly guitar music. And then, and of course, the communities of people of color disappeared. Their suffering was there as a narrative device, but they're never allowed to say anything about why they do they understand their condition? What are they going to do about it? But the fact is that there is organizing happening from frontline communities across the world. And so the film was a way of showing that in resistance to these sort of standard boring narratives of, me or Jeffrey Sachs or Vandana Shiva just say, well, you should probably do something about the food system. It's very bad. And so showing frontline communities actually doing stuff is, for me, is really hopeful, because it interrupts the narratives that we have about, oh yeah, everyone in Africa is sort of pathetic and they're just waiting for the next shipment of food, where in this community they've taken on hunger by ending patriarchy, and they are able to teach us how patriarchy works and how to stop it. And they've got some very good ideas about that. And that's not something that you see in food films about America. So part of the idea here was this international solidarity and a bit of humility in the United States about us not being as great as we thought we were, despite a president who already made this country great again. But the idea of the film was to push back against those kinds of narratives. And increasingly, the journey of this film is to put it in the hands of communities who want to do something about climate change but don't know where to start. And in particular, in faith-based communities. Now, I'm the least godly person that I know, but there are lots of faith-based communities that have taken this documentary and run with it, because the language of this documentary is not of policy wonks, but of the very faithful woman in Malawi who leads the charge here. And that idea that actually faith is a really important fulcrum for change is something I've discovered in this journey. So this is a long way of saying, well, what works in writing, in change making? Is it just put ideas out there and hope they stick? Or is it increasingly, as I'm finding, asking communities, what do you want? What do you need to be represented in the world? And so the journey of this film, initially this film was me going around the world and saying, well, this is an amazing thing, and this is an amazing thing, and this is an amazing thing. And as I was, working with the production team, I realized there was something quite wrong when I was doing a sort of David Attenborough thing, where it's like, and here we are in Malawi. And if you listen quietly, you can hear the Malawians fight hunger. And look, here they are. Look, and they're dancing and they're doing lovely things. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, hang on, wait, I'm the colonizer here. I'm the dick in this story. And since we had to move out of that mode, we stopped pursuing. Jake Gyllenhaal was going to narrate this, and we decided that was a bad idea for so many reasons. A bad idea, but in the end, it's the voice of Anita Chitaya narrating in Tumbuka, a language that not even everyone in Malawi speaks, and it's a much more powerful film, and its cadences fall in a very different way. So the journey for me in my writing and in my change making has been to decolonize myself, and that's been quite a journey. But I was, it was through the grace of people like Anita that was possible. I mean, it took 10 years, but it was, it's a journey. But in the same way that, I will be for the rest of my life sort of whacking the patriarchy out of me, and recovering from patriarchy. This is just a long journey, but again, through the right kinds of political formation, it's possible to do that.
So there's like a seed of frustration and discontent with the status quo or the current solution. That's something I see very much in common between organizing, activism, entrepreneurship. It starts with this kind of personal reaction that provides kind of an energetic motivation. It's kind of inexplicable, but I like that you also have framed it as a journey as opposed to an objective or a reward at the end, that you really see that you learn just by embarking. You don't really know where you'll end up, but you have to sort of trust the process a bit, that you will, like you just said, you will decolonize yourself along the way, and that would be satisfying to you.
Well, I mean, but that's the problem, right? That if I'm sorry, well, we're gonna.
That's all right. Go ahead.
I'm just. But here's the thing about both the activist world and the entrepreneurial world, where you're like, I mean, the standard sort of story of the sort of tech bro is two white guys getting together and saying, what if we could eat NFTs? What if we could? It's the most preposterous ideas, and then some other people from Silicon Valley be like, "That's a great idea. Here's $1 billion. Off you go." In the activist world, there's a bit more sort of self-righteousness about this. But what if we're the problem? What if in this sort of moment of recognizing that yeah, that's fucked up, but me with my fake meat or my whatever it is, I'm the solution. I'm the white knight, or whatever the appropriate term is. But I'm the good guy in this story. But what if that narrative isn't right? What if, in fact, you're perpetuating some of the worst sort of moments of power and inequality in the practice that you say is better than this thing, which it probably is, but it nonetheless perpetuates some of the deeper problems. And I wonder what mechanisms then we need in place to be able to call us on our shit. And for me, the great joy of working with social movements is that social movements are very happy to call me on my shit. And that's important, because unless there is a group to whom you are accountable as an entrepreneur or as an activist or whatever it is, then you're just sort of charging off, fueled by nothing other than what if, or your own sort of righteous inspiration about how crap that is and how much better you are. But if it's not grounded in people being able to call you out, then you might be the bad guy in the story.
That's fascinating. I'm going to come back to that, but because Josh is standing here for 20 minutes.
Sure, yeah. Hi, Professor Patel. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Josh.
Good to have you here tonight. I just want to go back a second. You said it a minute ago that basically that we're unwilling to address climate change. And I wanted to ask, like, who you meant by the we in that situation. Did you mean we, the American citizen, like the individual American citizen, or like the American government at large? Because I think that's, at least on the individual level, not true. I think that there's many American citizens throughout the country who do want climate change, to be addressed in a meaningful way. And one of the ways that I think that it can be addressed, and something that you also talked about, was basically enhancing this like basic biodiversity of the microbiome. Basically, these monoculture farms that you had a slide on dominate, majority of the land throughout the country, which also provide majority of the food. And that's an issue that we also touched on, I believe, in our last class. And I wanted to present a similar question that I presented last time, which was that, do you think that a potential solution to, increasing that biodiversity in the microbiome could potentially be like, breaking up these large land holdings of these large corporations using potentially like antitrust legislation, and then dispersing that land to smaller farmers, particularly organic farmers, because they're the ones that are having like the most positive impact on the environment.
I love that idea. Thank you. So, I mean, does America need land reform? Yes. Because, as you know, America's largest farmer is Bill Gates. He owns the largest amount of farmland in this country. And because, why wouldn't you? If you were Bill Gates and you had squillions, I think this is the technical term, of dollars, and you needed to park it somewhere where you could reliably get a return, plus you know that it's in an asset class that is dwindling and is only going to go up in value, then farmland is your investment of choice. Because farmland is, as Madeleine Fairbairn's brilliant book title suggests, is like gold with yield. If you want to know more about that, Madeleine Fairbairn's book is available free from Cornell University Press. It's very good. But the idea that one of the consequences of Bill Gates' buying up all this farmland is that he's locking it into monoculture, right? And by having this vast amount of land where you have a rentier farmer who needs to make the rent. And what's the only way you can make the rent, given the architecture of subsidies and the industrial agricultural system? Well, you farm a monoculture, you use as much of the chemicals as you need to be able to get a profit, and away you go. But if we were to transform the architecture of farming in the United States so that small, sustainable agroecological farms could thrive rather than these big ones, then Bill Gates would lose his money, which is, I'm okay with that. And I think that then what we would need is land reform, because agroecology doesn't work on the kinds of scales of farm that Bill Gates has. But so raise your hands if you are going to fight for land reform. There we go. So that's what I mean about Americans are not ready, which is that at some level, the scale of the problem is vast. And it's too big for us to comprehend. And we are paralyzed by anxiety. The kinds of solutions that we are given are the obviously laughable ones of metal straws, canvas bags, and look, how many Teslas do you need to drive to stop climate change? And if those are the solutions that based on individual consumption, and collectively the United States doesn't have the imagination to embark on a red, black, and green New Deal, as you will learn about in Professor Daniel Cohen's class, then what do we have? We've got rubbish kind of half solutions and a shrug of the shoulders and a lot of anxiety. And so the people who are making out like bandits are therapists, but that's not the solution to climate change. And again, it's the individual solution where, look, we all have anxiety about climate change, and that's legit. You are allowed to be very worried about the future of the planet. But the way out of that, it seems to me, is by embracing the radical change that you're suggesting, that we do actually need land reform. But it's so hard to think that. And that's what Anita Chitaya saw when she came over from Malawi to the United States. And there were very few communities that were doing anything approaching the scale of the change that was required, in part because because of the sort of frameworks of capitalism keep us where we are. So that's, again, this is not to say, look, if I say, who doesn't give a shit about climate change, I'm not expecting anyone to raise their hand. But I am saying that maybe we're not doing nearly enough. And the scale of our imaginations is intentionally small. And we live under a political system that is intending to make us dream small dreams about what it is that we can do. And that's not okay, because the problem is far bigger than the current politics allows.
Raj, you have the distinction of having participated in a number of protests and acts of solidarity. Where just in your arc of experience, it feels like, to me, Berkeley is a pretty quiet place compared to maybe the way it was in earlier times. What are the conditions for people getting more organized and active, and in your experience?
One of the things that's keeping you down, you don't need to tell you this, is debt.
And grades.
Sorry?
And grades.
No, the grades. Fuck the grades.
Okay.
No, it's the debt. No, everyone gets an A, right? Everyone gets an A.
Okay, sounds good.
Possibly, but no. I mean, honestly, I mean, I went to school for free because of this sort of moment where in the UK, going to Oxford was free, and going to any university was free, except that there's one private university where the idiots go. But all the universities in the United Kingdom are government institutions, and back in the day, there were no fees. And just like the National Health Service in the UK is one of these things where you don't pay for healthcare at the point of use. Obviously you pay for it in taxes, but it's a way of it's a dimension of liberty that you don't know, and debt is an incredibly pernicious way of stymieing folks' imaginations, because if you are in debt, then and you see, again, this gets us back to the inflammation story, right? If you are in debt severely, then not only is that impacting your body and impacting the ways that you narrate your future, and you think about time, and you think about your cognitive resources, your bodily resources are sort of consumed by the need to repay. And indebtedness is one of the things that prevents broader, is a tool in an arsenal that prevents broader thinking about what we could do if things were different, because you're so worried about getting out of Berkeley and getting a job and repaying that loan. So, I mean, I do think that that's something that, when one thinks about sort of the characteristics of big social movements, the folk who are involved in it may have been, certainly economically oppressed. But the sort of formation of the movements were not as crimped by debt as student life in the United States is, for a start. And I think that's one of the great successes of neoliberalism in keeping everyone down, is through the spread of debt, particularly in the United States. But that's why organizations like the Debtors Union are so exciting. The idea of debt collectives and going on debt strikes can be incredibly powerful and incredibly liberating. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, debt atomizes you and makes you think about yourself and your body in the same ways, this sort of individualized way, and it's worrying.
So, is there any connection between that and going out to make a film to express your view and make change? How do you do that without going into debt? How do you attract the resources in our society today to bring your vision into being?
Well, I mean, this film we're still $300,000 in debt, but that's okay. Everyone who is owed money and will never be paid it is okay with that. So that's sort of, I mean, just to be practical for a second, that's sort of debt that will become a gift. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So
it's like it'll be a philanthropic donation to the cause.
Right. Yeah, no, it took 10 years to make that film. And while the folk who, did the sound and did the camera work and all the rest of it were paid, myself and my co-director, in the end, I think we made $10,000 over 10 years. So it's not, I don't recommend going into it for the money.
It's a labor of love, and you need a day job.
Right. And so, I mean, for me, I'm always hustling. That's what I choose to do, right? I don't have a full-time job at the University of Texas. And I'm part-time, I'm untenured, and I hustle. And so in part, I make my living from writing books. I do it from talking at universities in the United States, not here, but elsewhere, that can afford something of a living. And then the rest of the time, I'm going from one thing to another, to another, to another. It's not a secure living, but it means that I am not beholden to. I don't do well with bosses. Basically, is my problem. And so while I have cordial relations with my dean at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, he and I both know that I can walk away if things start getting a little squirrely, and that works for me. But in general, there are collectives that, that can hold space and that can hold workers while we do this kind of thing. And so this film was produced with one of America's greatest documentary production houses called Cartemquin Films. If you've heard of a documentary called Hoop Dreams, just show of hands, has anyone here seen or heard of Hoop Dreams? That's a generational thing. It's one of the greatest documentaries in American history. It's 2 3/4 hours long, and it's about black men in Chicago and their ambitions to play basketball. And one of the reasons this is such, here's a sign that it's a good film. Like my in-laws come from North India. They don't know very much about basketball or Chicago, and they watched it riveted from beginning to end, because it's a great documentary. You're pulled in with amazing stories. And anyway, so this documentary production company, Cartemquin, holds space for activists to do films that take, that last that long, that take several years to do. In fact, the director of Hoop Dreams shot some of the stuff that you saw in that trailer. So I've been lucky to find the right kinds of collectives to help support the work. But is it for everyone? No, and it's certainly not for you if you're trying to get rid of debt. And that's, again, that's a struggle that you have. That I am in solidarity with you, but I wish that there were different systems under which your debt could be relieved sooner rather than later.
Well, I like your themes of collaboration, collective collaboration, and well, another piece of pattern recognition of an entrepreneur, a change maker, is just bristling at being employed or having to report to somebody else who's telling you what to do, or for whom you have to perform. You perform for yourself, which is the highest standard and probably the most critical voice, around you, I would imagine.
But again, this gets back to our discussion of to whom are you accountable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That at some level, yes, I have a boss who can fire me, but then I have the Soils, Food and Healthy Communities, group to whom I am accountable for this film.
Right.
And they can't fire me, but they can certainly call me out. And I think that those, the lines of power there are important to be clear about, who really is in charge.
Putting yourself to be accountable to a community is a different kind of relationship.
That's right.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Another question. Tell us your name and.
Hey, my name is Vivek. Thanks for a fantastic talk. I was curious, as someone who's interested more on the policy and wonkish side, sort of like you were saying, and then I think it's really interesting how you transition into a lot of the activism work and elevating activists. I'm curious what that transition was like and whether you've been able to bridge them, or I don't know. It seems like as a student, I'm interested in learning what's going on in the world, or what if there was a policy that could fix this, but then do you then have to convince other people of that? Or I'm curious how the dynamic works out and if there is a way that bridges them effectively.
Thank you for that wonderful question. I think for me, I do a bit of both, right? I'm quite happy to be in the streets, protesting and engaging in marches and lobbying, hurling imprecations at our elected leaders. At the same time as I'm also happy to be negotiating with the state of California around trying to get the state to adopt something called the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, which is a policy that essentially says, look, the most important sites of food system change are usually state houses and state capitals in the United States. So while we wait for the federal government to get its shit together, we will continue to wait and fight for that. State houses and governments, state governments are interesting places to be able to think about food and climate change. The Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration is a sort of network of people who are doing this work, and by people I mean cities and states like Scotland and Catalonia are the big states that have signed up so far. But so I'm excited about this work Because at the policy level, what the declaration and what some of this work does is create space. But it's like, human rights. Everyone loves human rights. Human rights is a good thing. But human rights only matter when you are ready to fight for them. Because otherwise human rights are violated every day. Human rights are only useful insofar as they can be weaponized to be able to achieve change. And in certain circumstances, discourses of human rights can be very reactionary. And in certain circumstances, they can be very useful. So for me, the way to bridge this is to say, well, look, let's create the space and the mechanisms to be able to achieve things. But then you have to fight like hell to get them. And that means naming capitalism and naming the forces that are obstructing and creating the problems in the food system that you're trying to address. So, I think it is possible to have an insider and outsider strategy. But if you're in the belly of the beast making the policy happen, again, that's even more important than to be accountable to the outsiders who are on the streets demanding the actual policy that you want to see. But again, it comes back to this thing of like, you as a change maker, you want to make change. Where are these ideas coming from? How are you accountable to the people who created these ideas? As a policy wonk, there are ways in which you can say, well, you on the streets have this fantastic idea about agroecology. There are ways of talking about how agroecology is great for biodiversity, great for resilience, great for adaptation, great for carbon sequestration. We can do the math on that. But in order for agroecology to prevail over industrial agriculture, it's not just that we need the numbers. The numbers are not going to get you anywhere. They're going to be useful in an argument in which you are fighting. You're not merely presenting something to Governor Newsom and saying, hey, look at these numbers, they're fantastic. Agroecology is so much better than the sort of harebrained schemes of the Central Valley Republicans. Because that's not going to work. The way that policy works is not merely through the triumph of good ideas, but through the sort of idea, the triumph of political organizing when the good ideas are there presented in the policy format in tandem. So there's definitely sort of dialectics between sort of street politics and inside the state house politics, for example, that I'm doing at the moment. And I think it's possible and necessary to do both in one way or another. But again, the accountability matters. Who's going to call you out if you settle for something less than what it is that was being demanded on the street? Who's going to call you out when you sell out?
Do you think walking into this community of accountability is a form of like energizing you to stretch, and it's sort of a self-motivated challenge, isn't it? To go beyond yourself, and
it's certainly it's about being vulnerable and about being tender and being open to being called on your shit. And again, sort of patriarchy. We will be recovering from this forever, and that's it is. That it's just the journey that we're on, and to be in spaces where being called on our shit is not. It requires vulnerability, but it also just requires just being clear that on occasions and because of the structure of society, we're often wrong. Right? We're on the wrong side of a power dynamic. And the process of recognizing and holding the space, being in a space where that shit is called out is important for us as we become different and better people, as we recognize what patriarchy has done to us and how it's damaged us. So is it exciting? Yeah, I'm excited not to be patriarchal. I'm down with that. I think that's an exciting journey. But it's emotionally, it can be, it's not easy, right? Because you lose, there's a process of reconstruction, but that's also necessary. It is the journey, it is the work, and particularly as here we are, broken settlers on stolen land, and we all have to be in this process of reconstruction. And there are ways of doing it that make us better people, that will hurt. There will be pain, but it will be worth it. And I think that's what that vulnerability is all about, when you're being held to it.
I think I'm seeing it now. It's just your energy is so great and intense, but what you're really talking about is humility.
Yeah.
At the heart of this. So I wanted to have sort of one last question, because so many of the students, are sitting here and thinking, how do I get from where I am now to that next act? And what do I bring with me? I think you just answered it, really. You bring this sense of humility, accountability, and intention, really, toward this doing what, like you said earlier, what you only could bring from your experience and preparation and view of the world. So how would you answer that for the students? What would you encourage them to, it just seems to me today there's so many choices and options and distractions and paths, and how do you sort that out? What wisdom would you impart to inspire this group of edible eaters,
Don't do it
enlightened
alone.
eaters? Don't do it alone.
I mean, this is collective work. I mean, to some extent, there's going to be a bit of therapy, but you can't decolonize on a therapist's couch. You can't confront white supremacy. You can't confront patriarchy. You can't do all of these things. This is not a job for a therapist. This is a job for collective action, and for engaging in the kinds of big dreaming, say, about land reform. Which, again, thank you for that question. I mean, this is the sort of thing where you get to dream big, but not alone. The good ideas come in movement and as part of political organizing, rather than through just sort of dreaming by yourself and sort of looking back at the ceiling and wondering what if, because that's what the tech bros outside are doing.
Let's have a big thank you and big round of applause for Raj Patel.